What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to Dynasty Underdog. Billy Beeman here. Got Uriah Dawkins with me as always. And we're going to get right into it because we're excited to be joined by the OG himself, Leo P at Siga_FF on Twitter. If you want to enjoy some really incredible educational threads, I mean, they're awesome. That's really a big reason why we brought him on here, because he's an outside the box thinker. And we kind of like to attack those topics. So I thought it was really fitting. Leo, how you doing tonight, man?
I'm doing great, and I'm really happy to be here. And I agree with you 100%. You guys are always on those fringes where change happens and looking at things from a different perspective. So I'm happy to get into it with you guys.
Excellent. Oh, massive compliment right there. Massive compliment. Okay, so before we get into our topics, we're going to talk a little bit about tracking league mate tendencies, thinking about overthinking, which we tend to do here a little bit. We overthink sometimes. But before we get into that, I do want to talk a little bit about you, introduce our audience to you a little bit more, the ones who don't know you, which if they listen to us, they probably do know you. But anyway, you're a longtime Football Guys writer. You've been in this space for a long time. But really, how long have you been playing Dynasty? What is that history, and how did it kind of transition into the content space for you?
So I started playing fantasy football back in the late 80s. So that was strictly redraft, but it was a long time ago, right? That was back when it was the USA Today and it was faxing scores, and there were no websites, no massive amounts of data available at your fingertips. It was a completely different landscape in the late 80s, and that morphed into keeper leagues in the mid 90s, and then in the early 2000s that kind of transferred into just full-fledged dynasty leagues. But it was a growth process from redraft to keeper to dynasty. And, I've dabbled in everything along the way, whether, keeping my foot in redraft, keeper leagues to some extent. But I've watched the landscape change completely to go from, touchdown only leagues to PPR to Superflex to all the unique scoring in the fishbowl, all of that, kind of watch that happen, watch the community and the culture change as social media and websites have popped up everywhere. Again, it's a different animal than it was even 5-10 years ago. So that's been interesting to watch that. And I got into content in the early 2000s, kind of right around the Dynasty time, when Dynasty really started to gain a good foothold in it's still kind of niche, but at least there was a big enough audience that it was something that it wasn't a unicorn in the early 2000s. And started out with a website that's now defunct called Dynasty Football Warehouse, and then transitioned to DLF for a lot of years. And then, like you said, now I'm at Football Guys, and I'm very sporadic with my content. For me, it really comes down to, do I have something to say? There's a lot of folks in the industry who are really, really good at churning content. Like, they'll do that weekly article and they'll have those weekly topics. That's just not me. If there's not really a message to get across or something that I want to talk about, I just can't drop content for the sake of dropping content. So at least I found a home where I'm able to do that. And there's not that expectancy to churn that weekly article. It's more along the lines of, when you have something to say, write it and we'll give you a platform. So everything works out really well.
I love that. And it really comes through in your Twitter threads and stuff like that. Like, it's clearly stuff that is not what other people are putting out there. It's something that you're very interested in, and it really resonates with me. You talking about kind of doing the deeper dives, like at my time at DFF doing the weekly content. Over time, it was like, all right, I really want to focus on the deeper dives, the more the deeper research, or the stuff that is a little bit maybe on the fringes of Dynasty, right? Not so much like player takes and all that stuff. Like you're saying, there's a lot of people doing those kind of threads every day, and we're a little bit more interested in the other stuff, the stuff that not everybody's talking about. So what are your feelings like on Superflex? Are you big on the Superflex wave these days, or is that one of the transitions you're not a fan of?
Yeah, so I've come around to it more in the in the last year. I was pretty adamant up until about a year ago that I was not a fan of it, because it just, in my opinion, overvalued quarterback position so much. But, there's been quite a few leagues that have kind of tweaked the scoring to some degree and have brought down the relevance of the quarterback position. So you can still build that way, but it's given some viability. And I think the fishbowl has a lot to do with that, because I think, Scott's creative approach to scoring and the uniqueness that he tries to layer in every year gives, I don't know, kind of a blueprint for other commissioners, for other leagues to kind of follow that level of creativity and dial things back to make it, because the idea is to build it, to be able to put your own blueprint together, to be able to add your layer of uniqueness to how you build a roster. And so if you can devalue quarterbacks in a super flex, but still give the flexibility to start basically whatever kind of lineup you want with minimum requirements, that's kind of got me to buy back into the super flex format again, simply. But if you just go straight, basic PPR scoring and and when you do a draft and the first, 14 picks are quarterbacks, that can really change the economy in a dynasty league, especially, as you start to move forward. So I wasn't a big fan of it, but I've come around.
Yeah. The fishbowl really gave me some ideas in terms of like our listener leagues, because we do a lot of listener leagues, trying to get more people into dynasty. But the next one, I wanted to do something where we did try to quote unquote fix QB scoring, because I love the way that he introduced the idea of negatives for incompletions, or extreme negatives for pick sixes, all the of course, all those kind of things. And I like how you're talking about kind of the choose your own adventure roster setup where you can do whatever you want. But also I like how it kind of, where if you can fix it, quote unquote, fix it like that with the scoring, you can also make it where it feels more appropriate, right? Where it's like the top end quarterbacks are actually really good. And then there's some quarterbacks who you could probably fill in here and there based on matchups and whatnot, but you're not going to be able to just slot them in and pick them super early. So I love that idea. And I think people should come around to that and try that in their leagues. I know we don't love doing the unconventional in the fantasy world. Not everybody wants to change. We don't like change, but I do think that if we tried doing that, we might enjoy ourselves a little bit more in the super flex space specifically.
Yeah. Well, when Geno Smith is outscoring, CMC on a weekly basis, there's a problem.
Yeah.
Exactly. Nailed it right there. Okay. So with that, we're going to move on and we're going to hop into the meat of the show here. I do want to talk to you about the things that you're actually interested in. I want to get your thoughts on these things. There are things that we've talked about before, but I feel like you do bring a pretty unique perspective. So let's jump into one of the things that you have created some pretty substantial threads on, probably a lot of content around this, but it's tracking league mate tendencies, right? Something I don't think a lot of people do, or at least not in a structured way, really. Right. We try to remember everything about our league mates. We have a lot of conversations, so we're going to know our league mates, but there's probably, even more we can do to kind of gain an edge in our dynasty leagues. And that's what we're trying to do here. So with tracking league mate tendencies, what is your technique and impact? Like, how does this help you? And how do you actually track the tendencies? Like, is this by memory, or do you have it in a spreadsheet? Like, how are you managing this? Because it does seem like it can become a lot of work.
Yeah. So you're going to have to set the egg timer up, because I can talk about this for the next 3 hours. So, but no, seriously,
I'll stop you somewhere.
Yeah. So it really comes down. So let's back up a little bit, because it really comes down to two aspects, two reasons why this works. I think is the first reason is because it's what I said earlier. So much data is available to everybody right at their fingertips. We all have the same access. You're going to have a particular ranking system or value system or informational articles. There's really no benefit to really doing your own homework like there was even 5 years ago, because 5 years ago you were dealing with folks walking into a draft or even drafting online with a magazine that was already 2 months old. So if you stayed plugged in and engaged, you were able to make decisions and valuations that put you in a position to succeed, because not everyone had the same access to all this information. Now everyone does. So where is the advantage? The advantage to me lies in the psychological aspect of the game, because not everyone has that at their fingertips. It's, there's not a trade calculator that can figure out whether or not manager A likes to trade and manager B doesn't. Those are things that you're able to kind of track as you examine the culture of your league. So there's a person I want to give a shout out to, and I know you guys have interacted with him quite a bit, in your circle, but that's Tommy Blair. So he's
yes.
relatively new to the space, doesn't have a ton of followers, but I just want to encourage anybody who's listening to this, if you don't follow him, you should. He's a pretty creative thinker, and he really kind of has set roots up in the same area that we kind of like to gain a level of comfort in the fringes of the industry, where there are some psychological advantages. And you can follow him on Twitter at FFTommyB. So again, there's a shout out to him. And the reason why I'm shouting him out is because he had a tweet over the summer, which is part 2 of my explanation, where he said that he's looking forward to the day where folks treat dynasties as an ecosystem and not a stock market. And so I think that's really important if we're going to talk about tracking league mate tendencies. But I'll take it a step further. I think a dynasty league is an ecosystem, but its main influence is stock market valuations. That's what changes the ecosystem. So I think it's like an overlay on top of the ecosystem, because valuations matter. And so tracking league mate tendencies gives you an ability to have a language to interact. Ultimately, this comes down to a framework and dialect. How do you interact with your other league mates? And knowing how to interact with them, what language to use when you negotiate trades, when you're in the chat, all of that really has an impact going forward and putting you in a position to succeed consistently over time. So if you know which manager has to have a 3rd round draft pick thrown in every time in order to complete a deal, if you know which managers are risk averse, and usually what will happen over the course of a window in time is that you will have 1 or 2, 3 or 4 maybe managers who are going for it, 3 or 4 managers who are rebuilding. And so you need to kind of understand that ecosystem and how to maneuver in it and how to talk to these managers. And so tracking league mate tendencies will make that, will eliminate a lot of the double work. We'll put you in a position to knock on the right doors with the right offers and just be more successful in making these trades. How do I track it? So I like to write. I like pen to paper. I'm old school. I'm almost 60. That's what I do. Some folks use spreadsheets. Some folks use spreadsheets. But I like to go pen to paper. And I like to, when I started out originally, I would track everything. Like I just found that was fun for me. Like that was the enjoyment piece. And I would kind of track blind bid waiver money, and I would track, how to trade negotiations go and how did trades go down when I wasn't even involved in it. Did the person go to the league chat first? Did they go to the trade bait? Did they, did they trade the same type of valuations if they were title chasing or if they were rebuilding? Because I've had some managers that you couldn't trade with them for anything if they were title chasing, but the second they went to rebuild, they sold the farm. So knowing that mattered, right? So I would track all of it over the years, because I've been doing this for a long time. Over the years, I've got to the point where I've kind of refined it and I know what to track. And that's so I don't waste a lot of extra time tracking things that I really didn't find value in. But when I first started out, I mean, I would try, and this actually started out in redraft. I would start tracking tendencies in my redraft league, my local leagues. I would track because we had some turnover. And so I wanted to know who these new guys that were coming in, these new folks that were coming in, how did they draft? What were their tendencies? How did they trade? So that just carried right over to Dynasty.
And so, yeah, I mean, that's really awesome and a really unique way to understand your league. Cause like you basically have an inherent edge in almost any league you're in because you're probably doing more of that work than anybody. So you're going to optimize your interactions with your league mates, right? You're going to be able to get things done quickly and when you need to get them done. So I am interested in understanding kind of like, so this is more like, I guess, application or like how you're actually doing it, but because you're doing it pen to paper. So if you have a question to yourself, like, what is this league mate doing in 2023 or 2022? Do you have a specific notebook for 2022? Or do you have like a specific notebook for your entire, like the league, and every year you're tracking in that notebook?
That's it. So it's a binder. Yeah, it's a binder for each league. Now, so I've really dialed back. I don't do very, very many leagues anymore. So there was a time when I was in over 30 leagues, 30 dynasty leagues. And so But I would have a notebook. I would have a binder, 3-ring binder for every league, and I would just, again, as time went on, I refined it so I wasn't sitting there constantly, because it's time consuming. But I really kind of dialed it back to two things. I dialed it back to trade negotiation, so I understood what doors to knock on. Does this person, if a player gets injured, does he want to sell right away? If this player gets caught getting a speeding ticket, does he want to sell right away? Does this person always want to buy risk? If he thinks he's getting, or she thinks she's getting value at a particular point because there's risk involved, is that the door I knock on first? Those were the things I tracked. The other things I really nailed down were just draft tendencies, because in a dynasty league, your draft is really your lifeblood to maintaining consistency. And so if there was always someone that had the same draft board that I had, if there was someone who drafted a particular position better, just was able to evaluate that position, did that come through in their draft picks year over year? Is there somebody I had to maneuver in front of, because chances are the player that I had picked for that target, that space, was going to be gone, because again, we drafted the same. So those are really the two areas that I focused on. So in a perfect world, it was trade negotiations, and it was draft picks. And as things have morphed, it's become more social media. Now who do you follow? Because those variations or valuations, if all of a sudden you listen to a particular podcast and that podcast says sell on a particular player, or buy, and that's one of your go-to sources, then that comes into play. Do you use a trade calculator? Because if you use a trade calculator, I can go to that trade calculator first, and I can find out if that deal is going to look good to you when you check it. So
keep trade cut. Yeah.
I mean, really. So, and the crazy thing is, I've had people say to me, well, you're never going to get that information from a league mate. And my point is that when somebody makes a successful trade, they get really loose lips. Like, they want to tell you about their process, because they're feeling really full of themselves because they just made a great trade. So I would always instigate conversations with somebody who won the deal and try to get a little bit more information about their process. Okay,
you'll actually ask them.
Yeah,
you'll ask somebody whose deal you weren't involved in, and just ask them.
Go into the league chat, and I'll be like, "Man, that was an amazing deal. I can't believe you pulled that off." And then then they'll start talking a little bit more, and then it's kind of like, well, then you want to know some specifics. All right, well, so do you forecast out? Like, how do you get your valuations? Do you do you forecast out over a 17-game season? Do you what is it that's driving your valuations? Are you looking for youth over productivity? What exactly are you looking for? And then it's you can have conversations. You can dig in even a little bit deeper, and you can kind of you can go after more specifics. Like, do you have multiple rosters? How many leagues do you play in? Do you do similar builds across the board, or do you have a lot of diversification? Those are all questions that somebody that just made a really successful trade tends to share that information, because they want to show you how smart they are across the board.
You're right. Does this not remind you of the conversation we were having in the Discord last night, where I was asking, if somebody asks you a question like, are you rebuilding, or something like that, are you like, what's your answer going to be? Right. And we got, right. Well, like, we got a couple different answers. Like, it was kind of like, depends, or like, you can use that to your advantage in kind of going after, other assets, maybe vets, if you're kind of in that tanking mode, and you can go after them for cheaper value. There were some other answers, but to me, if you're asking me all this stuff, Leo, I'm going to probably avoid answering those questions in some form or fashion. Like, I'm going to try to either give you a non-answer or just find a way to kind of exit the conversation. Do you find that happens, or more times than not?
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely. Okay. And then that's a notation, right? Okay. That didn't work. So it really depends. It depends on how someone's longevity, especially as a league. Right. If you're in the 10th year of a dynasty league, it's going to be different than in year 2 of a dynasty league. And again, if you're playing with somebody that is an experienced player that kind of understands how this works, you're going to get far less information than somebody who is relatively new, that is, again, happy to share their sources, or how they put together, what their algorithm is for a successful roster build. But yeah, I mean, that goes into the notebook. Okay, Willie didn't want to share. He didn't, that goes into the notebook. And so, okay, I got to keep a closer eye on some of his other moves. What are, like, let's go back and look at some of his other trades. Let's go, when is he selling? The other thing that this tells you is,
just as maybe not, maybe F yourself.
Yeah, what? And that's fine too. I've gotten that before, but it doesn't hurt to ask. You know what I mean? Like all I'm doing is so build a bridge or burn a bridge, right? I can be a jerk on a trade offer. I can say that's the worst trade offer I've ever gotten. I can burn a bridge, or I can build a bridge. I want to have doors that I can knock on because I've built a relationship with folks. The goal is never to fleece somebody. People like the idea of, hey, I fleeced somebody in a trade. I killed it. I nailed it. Great. But you know what? Did you sacrifice the next 10 trades because of what you accomplished? The goal is to always have a trade that benefits both teams. It's not always possible, but you want to be known as a shrewd trader, but a fair trader. Right? You don't want to be known as the guy that, oh my God, I don't want to deal with him because he's got to win every trade by 2 miles and nothing's ever fair and it's just a waste of time. You don't want to be that person. You want to be the person that answers quickly, that's engaged, that has dialogue, maybe doesn't share too much, but certainly is plugged in and building bridges as opposed to burning them down.
I love that. We've talked about that. I'll be brief, but yeah, like we always end up with trade partners that there's always somebody that's always sending like what we'll call bad trades. And, some people will take offense to it or, at some point get so annoyed that they become unpleasant to deal with. And then I feel like if you become that person and you let it get to you and try to affect that relationship in a negative way, then really you had 11 people that you could trade with. And now you've really messed it up. Now you only have 10. Mm-hmm. And if you keep going down that same process, eventually you're going to have 9 people you can trade with and 8 people you trade with. I just always like the idea of never actually burning a bridge, no matter like how terrible the offers usually are. There's always going to be something there. So I try my best to be cordial and keep that door open. So
always agree 100%.
Yeah, no, I love that stuff. And Joe comes here with, I think of it as a trade that makes sense for both teams rather than necessarily benefits both teams. And I do think that's a fairly good distinction because I am trying to do something that benefits my team more than I'm trying to help anybody else's. But yeah, I want to make sense. I don't want to come at you with something, that's completely disagreeable or doesn't, work with your team build. That's not going to work either. So yeah, all fair points. I'm going to skip to league mate categories. And this one's pretty interesting to me. And maybe I'm more interested in how you navigate it rather than identifying it. But how do you identify and navigate what you label as Captain Ahab? A Captain Ahab league mate, which is a league mate who is hard to decipher. These are probably the most challenging league mates to compete against, right? So how do you kind of work around somebody who you can't really get a good feel for?
It comes down to, can you get a foothold, right? Is there something that's consistent as opposed to everything being crazy? But the best part about somebody that is really difficult to address and to define is that they're generally trade catalysts because of the chaos that they cause. And so they're a really good person to have on speed dial, a door that you can knock on, to have a good relationship with them, because every time you think that a door should be closed, it can be open because they don't react the way. I mean, that's I guess the best way. You've defined them as somebody who doesn't act in a normal consensus groupthink way. So that in itself provides value for you because, again, as long as you haven't burned that bridge and as long as you have an open communication line with that particular manager, it's a great opportunity to potentially, people like to generally trade in windows, right? There's usually a window, usually after an injury, after the first 4 games, the 8th game, the 12th game, people kind of reevaluate their roster, see where they're at. Okay, here are my challenges. I'm rebuilding. I'm going for it. And they make decisions that open trade windows. But somebody like that just is really hard to define, could be open for business all year round. So I think that's just defining it, knowing that they're not going to conform and be groupthink, and then being able to knock on that door and have them as a resource for negotiations is the vital piece to that.
Do you think you typically avoid that kind of manager I mean, it doesn't sound like you do, but I'm wondering, and also,
Yeah.
do you find that they are typically good or bad players, or is it just a mix? Like, do you find that the person who is like unpredictable is kind of getting ahead of the curve, or are they just like making random moves?
Yeah, I think it's both. I think
Okay.
that you have some folks who are just really good at zigging when when everybody else is zagging, and they stay at the front. We talk about change being at the fringes, and sometimes those folks are just really good at maneuvering their teams and player values on the fringes ahead of groupthink, and they're solid players. And I really like interacting with those folks simply because. Again, I think change happens on the fringes. So I want to understand it. If there's a way to understand it, I always, and we'll probably bounce back to this later because I think I wrote it down as it's an answer to one of the questions on the show sheet. But I really like to go from divergent to convergent thinking. I like to be out here and be abstract and be creative and just throw a ton of ideas on the wall and then refine it, right? Whether you're an artist or whether you write music, everybody starts kind of abstract and then really refines it and gets to the finished product. And I think folks that manage that way, if they're talented, can really give you that abstract approach so that you can maybe refine some things and make them your own as you get to kind of understand and see what the strategies are that they're trying to implement.
Oh man, I love that, because if you never journey for like the abstract, you will never know the possibilities that are out there, right? That you can kind of take from and, like you said, refine. So that's a great point. One thing that stuck with me that you said a few minutes ago, just in the league mate tendencies category of things, knowing the preferred analyst of somebody, that is one that I haven't keyed in on, but I'm going forward, because I really think that can be some of the most key information right now, because people really, really do. When they find somebody who's their favorite analyst, that's like somebody they trust, and they're going to make some moves, not all moves, but they're going to make some moves, to kind of follow in the footsteps of those analysts. So I think that's one that I want to try to key in on and kind of see if I can maneuver around in my league with my league mates this year and going forward. That's a good one. I like that a lot. Okay. So we're doing a lot of thinking. Really simple question here, but I am interested where you take it. When, we tend to do a lot of contemplating about our league mates and the strategies. We're talking about them right now. We dig into our league mates. We make notes about them. This is, we really think about this stuff. Do you ever think that we overthink this stuff and kind of get in our own heads too much?
Yeah, I think we do to a point. I think it's important to have your framework. I think your framework matters. I think we talked a little bit about having the right language for the right managers in your league. That matters. But for me, it really comes down to why I like pen to paper, not just because I'm old, but because I write it and then I move on. And I think if you swim in those thoughts in that process and you allow it to become, you saturate, then you overthink. But I think if you write down your point, whether it's on a spreadsheet, whether it's in a notebook, you basically finalizing it. You're putting pen to paper. You're saying, this is what I've noticed. This is what I think could be an asset to me moving forward. And then you move forward and you don't just dwell in that. So that for me is the key to making sure I don't overthink things. I think if I didn't write it down and I just kept pondering it and kind of on that merry-go-round and just thinking about it, sure, it's dangerous. You can overthink everything. So I think in life in general, I tend to write things, whether, it's in a journal, whether it's, for work, whatever it might be, you write it down, you move on and you kind of move on to the next topic, and it keeps you from just, treading water in one spot.
I guess that's a good way of thinking about it. Like you said, it can be dangerous and challenging dissecting others, tendencies or intentions and all that kind of stuff. But I guess writing it down is the safeguard against that, right? Because you can go back and look at what you've written down, make sure that it's either it is a tendency or it's just, a one-off, those kind of things. So I guess that is a good way to keep yourself grounded and make sure that you're not doing too much of the overthinking. But I wondered, like, do you think that these methods can be used against you? Like, people know what you're doing. They know that you're thinking about these kind of things. Do you think that players ever avoid you because of it?
Mm.
Well, I think that, we saw that comment where somebody was like, F you in the answers. I mean, certainly that's happened where, I know what you're trying to do. And sure, so certain dialogue has been avoided over the years. I'd like to think I'm an adaptive enough manager that I think you can pin me down in a year, like in a year window in Dynasty, because once you start to really execute a strategy, you generally see that strategy through, and you can adapt it and move it to some degree. But if you've gone zero running back, or you've gone, running back heavy, whatever build super flex, you've gone 4 quarterbacks and you're looking to trade, whatever strategy you're trying to implement for that given window. Usually it's in season and maybe, an off season. So you can pin me down in that window, but I think year to year, it's important for me. I like to study my concepts. I like to review, and not only am I tracking league mate tendencies, but I'm also kind of monitoring and grading myself. Does this strategy work? What could I have done better? I like to know whether or not the process was flawed or my choices were flawed, because they can be two different things, right? My process may have pinpointed 4 or 5 people, and I may have just picked the wrong person. Sure. The other 3 might have been successful because the process itself, the formula I was using, or the method I was using, the strategy I was using, was really pretty sharp. It's just that the results it gave me were varied enough that, multiple choice, and I picked C and D instead of A and B. So I need to validate that. Was it the process? Was it my choice? And maybe the process was flawed. There's been plenty of times where I've come up with what I thought was the best idea ever, and when I tried to actually implement it, I'm in the bottom 3 teams in my league. So it happens. But I need to grade that, and I need to evaluate that, and I need to adapt, right? If it isn't successful, I'm not going to try it. Am I just missing 1 piece? Am I missing 3 pieces? Did I miss it entirely? And those are conversations that I like to have with certain folks that, I consider my brain trust, folks that are in my tight circle that I've been playing with for a long time, maybe not necessarily in leagues head to head together, but that I respect their game. And, hey, what are your thoughts on this? And that feedback matters. And I really like to have those conversations with folks that don't see the game the way I do. Certain folks that have a completely different perspective, because I don't need an echo chamber. What I need is somebody who looks at things differently and can validate, if I can get somebody that doesn't look at the game the same way I do and they validate my process, that's a hell of a lot more important than somebody who, think we walk lockstep together.
Yeah, that's why we love when the analytics match our film takes and vice versa, right?
That's right.
It's the same thing. Absolutely. So if you make, I'm wondering, this isn't on the sheet, but if you have preferred builds, or if you have moves that you make that are successful, right, and those can become predictable, do you change your strategy ever, or do you kind of keep on the course? Say you're doing a new league with people that are familiar with what you do, and you have a preferred way of playing. Like, are you going to modify things, or are you just going to continue down your path, understanding that maybe some people will try to attack you and you're just going to navigate around it?
I like to have my plan and execute my plan, but I will adapt to what the room does. I think it's really important to read the room quickly and try to get a feel for a draft, for other league mates, for what they're doing. If you're in a punt the initial draft strategy, and in year 2, 6 of the teams are rebuilding, then you need to recalibrate. You need to potentially say, okay, I punted the draft, but if I've got 6 to 7 teams in this league that are rebuilding, I'm going to win it next year, and I'm going to go vet heavy. I'm just going to change. And so I think that you have to, a lot of people talk about adaptive draft strategies. I think you need to have adaptive management styles all the time. And you can have a preferred method, but you need to be shrewd enough and skilled enough to execute other builds so that you're not always pigeonholed into one. You can't let others derail you. So if all of a sudden everyone addresses you and kind of attacks your strategy because they know it's been successful in the past. Well, you need to be able to be successful with another strategy. Mm-hmm. And I think that comes over time. I don't think a player that's relatively new to the hobby, to the dynasty format, can execute that seamlessly. I think that takes time, and it takes some failures to build up to kind of know just how far you have to pivot to still maintain success. It's hard to go from a 0 running back build mid-draft to a heavy running back build. That's really hard to pull off. So you really have to kind of know, all right, how can I adjust? How can I tweak this so that I can still maintain the build that I started, but still be more successful to counterbalance what the other drafters in this room are doing?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And I think something that not a lot of people do is look like a round or so ahead about like what the potential outcomes could be based on what you're going to do, like how that can all work out, and have that alternative plan. Because if not, you can get really flustered and make poor decisions. And so I think going into it like that is the best way to do it for sure. Okay, so as a dynasty vet, what is still a really challenging concept to truly master and become proficient in?
For me, it comes down to player contracts and offensive line changes in the offseason. I think those are two critical aspects to dynasty that I lose sight of because I get caught up in either the analytics or the film, and I fall in love with certain players, or I want to add a certain style or skill set to my roster, and I don't always factor in. I mean, because let's face it, with non-guaranteed money in the NFL, you could be adding, a 27-year-old running back that you think is going to give you a 3-year window, and they're not, because you don't know how that contract's built.
Good point.
You could be maneuvering for a particular, skill set position, and the offensive line could have changed so much over the course of the last 7 months that what you think you're getting, you're not getting. And again, contracts can come into play with that offensive line. So I think those are two aspects that I think I don't get a great grasp on. I think for a while, for me, it was coaching and relationships with players, and what does that look like? A quarterback coach, an offensive coordinator, wide receiver coach. What does that imprint? What does that mean for that particular player? What is their playbook? What type of wide receiver sets or offensive sets do they run when there's a changeover in the coaching staff? But I think I've refined that and gotten better at that. But again, with all the notebook and league mate tracking I'm doing, something's going to hit the floor. And a lot of times it ends up being contract. And so, again, but I rely on folks that are good at it. Right. I follow certain folks on social media and that, specialize in that and pay attention to that. And it's like I said earlier, right? So the advantages lie on the fringes because we have all the same information available to us at the click of a button. And so all the things that you're not proficient in, somebody else is. So, if you have the opportunity to study it, to review it, to get better at it. And if, even if you don't want to be taught how to grow food, you can still eat the food they're growing. So it's okay. You can, you don't need to be great at everything, where 10 years ago, to be a successful player in fantasy football, you really needed to have a handle on a lot more aspects than you do now.
Yeah, you can definitely rely on some resources these days for sure. Offensive line play, man, that is such a good shout. Like that is one thing that we really miss on, and just impacts everything, right? Literally from the passing to the running game. It's huge, and we never talk about it often enough. But one of the other things that you mentioned, coaching changes, coaching schemes, those kind of things. This was a big thing for me over the past couple of years. I had a lot of conversations with Jagger May back when we were working together at DFF, and on the side since then. Just, I didn't feel like we have a good resource for coaching schemes in general And so I started building out this coaching scheme database, and it's really starting from this year. And I'm working to kind of, build it up, and it's gotten to a pretty cool place. But having like the data of, how often they're running, up the middle, or how often they're running zone, how often they're doing all these different things. Like you're talking about the wide receiver sets specific to these play callers, right? Because I think it's just one thing we lose so much sight of and just have really not great information on. And so it's one thing I'm working on getting built up for the community, because I do think that would be, really great information for people to take with them, into their leagues, and understanding kind of how these players are doing what they're doing, or going to do what they're going to do. So that's a great shout right there. Do you find yourself as critical of yourself as you are of your league mates' tendencies?
More so.
Yeah.
More so. Yeah. I'm a perfectionist. I mean, and yes, I guess really what it comes down to for me is, if I can see the process being successful and I just made the wrong choices, I can live with that. If the process is broken and I came up with a process that really doesn't work, one thing I try to do, I've tweeted about this a lot, I really have a problem with folks that get the answer they want and then they work backwards. Like they find a process that gives them the answer that they want. And I try never to do that. I always want the process to give me the answers. And even if I don't like the answers, I want the process to give it to me. Yep. And so when I build something in my head or on paper that I think is a really good process to get to a certain place, and it doesn't pan out, I'm pretty hard on myself. But the one thing I do think I do well is I don't burn bridges, like we talked about earlier. And I think I maintain those open lines of communication. I think that's critical. But yeah, I definitely hold myself to a different standard, whether it's being a content creator, whether it's, being just kind of a sport enthusiast for fantasy football and trying to, I'm one of the elder statesmen in the industry, and I want to make sure that, I don't find myself in, a Cheryl Swoops, Caitlin Clark type of situation. And, I want to make sure that I'm uplifting the new folks that are coming into the industry, and I'm trying to do the right thing. So all the way around, I'm pretty self-critical just in making sure that I handle myself well in the leagues. I do a decent job. I perform well, and all of that really kind of matters. And so when I do my self-evaluations, definitely critical.
Yeah, I think that's probably the right way to do it. Like if you're being, that self-critical, you're probably going to get the best results out of yourself, and it'll help you better dissect other individuals, I think also. This is kind of out of left field, but I am wondering because so I use a lot of skills from my like professional life for Dynasty, and I try to take, things I've learned, in schooling, all that kind of stuff. And I know a lot of people do that stuff. Like, we have project managers who use project management for Dynasty and try to manage their teams that way. So the way that you tactically have gone about this, I wonder, are these skills you've used in your professional life at all? Or is this just something that you came up with for Dynasty?
That's a great question.
Yeah. So my background is supply chain logistics. That's what I've done, since the mid 80s, basically leadership positions. And, so a lot of this, I've worked closely with OpEx people, with project management people, and implemented a lot of new SOPs. And, I think the key component for me, the two things that really matter, I think it's hard to find a leader that can merge analytics with communications. You have some folks who are really good leaders when it comes to making decisions, and you have some folks who are really good leaders who communicate to their teams, but you rarely find leaders who can do both. And I think it's critical that you can do both, kind of what we talked about from divergent to convergent thinking. You have to be able to do both. And so reading the room and understanding your audience, being self-aware, so that you understand the impact you're having to your team or to your audience, and then being able to handle ambiguity. Those three things have been critical in my career, any career success I've had. And so those are the three things that I really try to build into my fantasy football because it's what I'm comfortable with. I mean, I had an article on Football Guys not that long ago that talked about how to use an Eisenhower matrix to improve your fantasy football drafts. Again, Eisenhower matrix is something that I've used for years in the industry I'm in, but I never really thought about applying it to fantasy football. And when I finally did, it was like, oh my God, this really helped. And so
I love it.
so yeah, and then just finding variants, right? Some of the other tools that I've used over the years have just been building spreadsheets, extrapolating data, and kind of using that to help funnel my own choices. And I know with a podcast that I do with Kevin Coleman and an article that I did for Football Guys, we talked about, okay, what does that look like? How are you finding the variants that you need to make deals? And so I kind of took tools that I've used my entire career, and I took, 6 different well thought of, reputable ranking sites and imported them into a spreadsheet, and then compared my own rankings without looking at them, and kind of found, I made a, macro that just basically compared variance and said, okay, here's where I rank them. Here's the consensus ranking of the top 6. These are the 20 people I should target as sells or buys. And again, things that I've done my entire career that, were easy for me to implement into fantasy football.
Killer answer, dude. Yeah, like I figured that there was a lot of this that came. It's very clear that it comes from somewhere that is established. So that's awesome. I love that because again, like I'm a data analyst and a programmer, and I use a lot of the spreadsheet tools that we've learned along the way and all those things. And I love just hearing how other people, because all the time I do the same thing where you've used something for so long at work, and then all of a sudden you're like, wait, I could use this for Dynasty and make this so much easier. Like, holy crap. And so I love hearing how other people can do that. It's just so cool. Okay. So before we move on to the last couple, I did miss one here, and I do want to get your answer on this. I think it's interesting. How do lineup submissions inform you about your league mates? This is a super interesting one. You put out on Twitter, folks know I set up shop in the psychological fringes of this hobby and try to track the micro and macro regarding league mate tendencies for an advantage. One interesting and underutilized area to try and gain information is by looking at lineup submissions. So this is one of those great threads that Leo puts out on Twitter, but I want to get your thoughts on it here, Leo. Why? Because I haven't even really considered this that much. What is it about lineup submissions that are so revealing to you?
So my age is going to show here a little bit again, because I'm way more comfortable with my fantasy league than I am with Sleeper. Not because I'm a desktop guy, and
that's Uriah showing your age too.
Yeah. Look, so I'm old on the inside.
Joking.
So this comment or this thread was geared toward MLF. I mean, I really don't know a lot of the intricacies of Sleeper, so I don't know if it could be the same. But so with MLF, there's a setting that you can get emails on your opponent's lineup changes. Every time they submit a lineup, you can get an email. And so it's one of the things, especially in a newer league, that I always made sure that I checked. And the reason being is because let's say you've got a league manager that you're playing against, and there's a wide receiver on that roster that you would really like to put in an offer on. And you see in the week leading up to your game, he's back and forth or she's back and forth on switching out that wide receiver with another wide receiver. And they settle on the wide receiver you want to trade for. That's who they go with. And that particular wide receiver has a terrible game, 2 for 12, no touchdowns. Is there a level of disgust and disappointment now because you knew the manager was already on the fence with that particular lineup decision? Is there now a door open for you to make a trade offer because you see that hesitancy that was going on during the week? So I think it gives you a glimpse into, first of all, the decisiveness of that other manager that you're dealing with. How plugged in are they? Because if you have injury news during the week, does that manager react in real time to that injury news? Or does that manager wait until 5 minutes before kickoff to finally log in and make some changes? Those are all bits and pieces. Again, maybe you're not notating that, but those are things that you can kind of retain to say, all right, this manager isn't engaged. This manager is very engaged. This manager's got 3 players that I want to trade for. All 3 of them he plugged into, or she plugged into their lineup at the last possible second. All 3 didn't play well, or 1 played great and the other 2 disappointed. So I think just that hesitancy and that lack of decision making can create an opportunity for you to go after. And maybe you weren't even thinking about targeting a particular player, but all of a sudden you saw that back and forth. The only caveat to this I would add is that, and I think seeing the multiple changes throughout the week kind of discredits it, but you do have to worry about certain apps that will make the selections for you. So there might not be a person behind the actual choices, but usually that's a last minute, 11 o'clock on a Sunday type change, as opposed to, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, back and forth. I had some managers over the course of my experience where they would change their line. I mean, I almost had to shut notifications off. Change their 6 times a day. And so it's almost information overload and doesn't help me. That just means they have no clue who they want to start. The other thing that's interesting is, do they really play matchups? Or do they play best, player available? I mean, it gives you another glimpse behind the curtain. What is, I like seeing when managers might play a 20th ranked wide receiver over a wide receiver who's kind of ranked 7th or 8th for the week based on the cornerback they're facing. That gives me a new level of respect for that particular manager, especially when it pans out that they're really, plugged in and they're kind of, transferring the daily, type of fantasy decisions into incorporating that into their own lineup decisions in Dynasty, which I think is critical. I think that's one area that Dynasty players really lose sight of, is the actual start sit decisions that have to be made based on matchups that you see a lot of the daily folks make pretty regularly and make strongly.
Yeah, we hate going against the consensus. We hate when the number isn't bigger than the bench player's number. We're like, well, can't have that happen. I need green bars across, make it look good. No, the MFL shout is awesome because it is informative, and I had not thought about that. I will going forward about the lineup switch in and out, and it's like, that could be a player that they're uncertain about. Just their profile in general, right? Like that's a really great peek behind the curtain that not everybody is thinking about. So that's definitely why I wanted to go back to that really, really cool tactic of yours there. Okay, so I see you talk about this quite a bit, or maybe just because I follow you, I see it enough. I don't know if you talk about it quite a bit, but I've seen it enough times where I'm interested in your thoughts on it. Why do you like leagues that have a set year to disband? Like we love Dynasty around here. We want, long-lasting leagues. We want the same lineups. We want the trading. We like all that stuff. But with these leagues in mind, like how does your approach change, from like a typical Dynasty league?
Yeah, absolutely. So basically, I think the ideal is 7 years. A lot of them end up being 5. I think I like it because it generally locks in those. If you're doing a 12-person league, it generally locks in those 12 people for the extent of the league. You're not generally looking to replace owners. In a normal Dynasty league, at least my experience, I think, you're lucky if you get one that lasts, 8 years, 9 years. A lot of them will disband on their own just after 5 or 6 years. Things happen, people move. You have kids, other financial implications. A lot of them just disband, or a lot of them should have turnover, right? You may start with 12 particular owners and you end up with, 6 new managers by year 5. This generally limits that. The other reason I like it is because it changes strategy over the course of the life of the league. We talked a couple times already about divergent to convergent. This is kind of similar, right? You start with an abstract dynasty philosophy strategy that you're building. And then let's say you really did a lousy job building your dynasty roster. Well, if there's a 5-year end date, it gives you more strategy opportunities to make changes and address and adjust. And it gives you an opportunity as the years go on to refine and refocus, go from a true dynasty strategy to a 2-year window strategy to a redraft strategy. Your final year that you play is truly a redraft strategy. The one
Right.
component that I like to add to this that I find interesting is having it be the one caveat, having it be like an Empire League. So let's say you decide 7 years, right? And so if you have a repeat champion before those 7 years, so when you pay up for the league dues, league fees, let's say it's, you know, a $200 league, $100 goes for that particular season for the prize money for that particular season, but $100 goes into the repeat champion pool in case there's a repeat champion along the way, along those 7 years. The one piece is, though, if you win it one year, you can't make any trades the following year. You are locked into your roster. You can only make.
Oh, wow.
You can only, because that way there can't be collusion, right? There can't be like, hey, if you win that second pot, we'll split it. I'm going to trade you, you know, CMC for. It eliminates that. You can't make any trades. That once you are the champion, the whole next year you are locked in from no trade. So every year there's a champion, and every year that champion can't trade.
Oh man, so bittersweet being the champion.
I feel so left out.
those are my favorite leagues. The ones that I've done over the course of my, you know, career have been 5 to 7 year windows, Empire repeat champion pots.
Wow.
If you win it, and then they're, you know, at the final year you basically become a redraft league that final year, and then you can start over. Then you get to do a whole new, if you still have the same folks together or the majority of them, you just do a whole new dynasty draft all over again. There's nothing wrong with that.
It does sound like a blast. I'm not gonna lie, it does sound like quite a bit of fun. Wow, that's interesting. There's a lot there, but that's really cool. That's really, yeah, we should do one like that.
Well, if you have any questions about the specific bylaws or whatever, I can pull up one of my old leagues. I can send them to you.
Oh yeah, I would love that, honestly.
Yes.
I think it's so interesting how it would go early from like picks being valuable to picks obviously declining in value over time and having to kind of adjust to that market change. And if you can get ahead of it, like if you can, I think you can do some really cool things and build kind of a monster. But then you probably won't be making any trades the following year. So, you know, that I guess it helps stacking up on the picks if you're doing that kind of thing. That's a really, really, really interesting format that I do think I would like to explore some more down the road. Really appreciate you for introducing us and the audience to that. It's a cool one. So before we get you out of here, I know, look, it's regular season is just 2 days away. Leo was really generous enough to come back from vacation and bless us with his presence. But I do want to talk a little bit about handling preseason and camp hype as we head into the season here. So you put this out on Twitter a while back, Tony Pollard bouncing around the timeline, you know, a few nice catches in camp. Now folks are screeching about value thievery, Titletown real estate by drafting him. You know, next week it'll be Tyjae Spears with another 7-second clip, and the same folks will be deleting those Pollard takes. You know, and it's an interesting one because we do get into this flow of just like overreaction and going crazy over, you know, confirmation bias, all that good stuff. And I just wonder, is this a behavior that you exploit during the camp hype season, or do you kind of tend to lay low and wait until things settle down, you know, around kickoff? Like, how do you approach the season leading up to the point scoring season?
The only thing I don't try to capitalize on daily would be my own starting lineup, because I don't think you need to have a perfect starting lineup in July or August. You need to have your best starting lineup week one. So I think the over focus on making, you know, the perfect trade in May, because, you know, you have to round out your starters. So for me, it really comes down to exploiting whatever I can, whenever I can. And if I have folks that follow a particular team or folks that have a tendency to, you know, overreact to camp news, we talk about league mate tendencies. Are there certain managers in your league that overreact to preseason hype? Do they overreact to week one results? Right? Yep. Sammy Watkins 3 years in a row had 5 touchdowns in week one.
Watson,
and then he didn't score again the rest of the year. So I mean, anytime there's an opportunity to capitalize on it, I think it's vital that you do. It's just knowing which are the managers that you can knock on their door and potentially, put together a deal, because that will move the needle for them. I think from your own personal perspective, I think it's just vital to follow beat reporters. I think this time of year, I think the social media mob just goes bananas with 7-second clips and clips of players without pads on, and every preseason training camp, Devontae Parker for the Dolphins was going to have 140 catches and 2,000 yards, and then he would do his normal 40 catches for 400 yards. So there are just players that just shine in training camp, and social media mobs that respond to that. And I think a lot of it comes down to the fact that we just want to have a clip to be able to post later and say I was right. I mean, seriously. We put out 600 players and say, look at this, look at this, look at this, and then one of them hits, two of them hits, and all of a sudden, look, I was on this guy back in in June. Follow the beat reporters, pay attention to the local folks that are, I think there's that one particular Twitter account. What is it? 32 beat writers.
32 beat,
yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, those are the folks that I think really add value this time of year, that will give you, the right critique, that will give you, both sides of the performance as opposed to just positives. And I think it's important to have a certain few voices that you trust, within the community. You have folks that you validate. I mean, you can't, you watch Twitter or X, and you'll have a particular player, and I can't remember who it was, but I had a tweet not that long ago where I took a screenshot of like 3 tweets in a row, and like 2 of them were negative, 1 of them was positive, and I was like, Twitter never changed, because
every time,
and that's right. That's all we see, right? We see the same player. You'll have 10 positive tweets, 10 negative tweets, and it's impossible. But if you have a particular voice that you listen to, talking about taking advantage of that from a trade perspective, but you really need to have those folks that you trust, their eyes, what they see, what their projections are, and they may not always be right. Chances are they're not going to always be right. But the bottom line is they're right more often than they're wrong, and you find value in there. So if you blend those two together, beat reporters and select few voices that you validated over the years, that. And I'll tell you what, folks with the fewer followers are generally like the folks that validate things for me aren't the folks with 80,000 followers. They're the folks with 2,000 followers that really have a good eye. So
you mentioned Tommy B, who deserves way more followers, and he's one of those guys for sure. And there's plenty of them. Our good friend and co-host Jake, he has way too few followers, and he's one of the headiest people we know for sure in this game, and has made crazy strides since he has joined the community. In terms of like how he plays, it's really cool watching that. And I agree with you. It's usually the underfollowed accounts that have some of the best content and they're the best ideas, forward-thinking ideas. Coach Speak Index also, along with 32 beat writers, those two to match together, you kind of get like exactly what you need, because it parses out kind of the nonsense for you. Go ahead. You're right. You got one?
Yeah, just because I was thinking that. I don't want to lose it, that account, the Coach Speak Index account, is actually teaming up with another guy, and they're coming out with their beat writer index.
Oh,
so they're gonna
see,
just how factual they've been in their reporting over the course of the last few seasons. I think just following those 2 accounts, like during the off season, you're going to be doing yourself a lot of good.
Yeah, absolutely elevates your game there. One other thing that Leo said that is huge, and this you need to take with you for sure. Always talk to somebody before executing a trade or making a move, whatever that you're contemplating. I mean, we've built such a great community with the Dynasty Underdog Discord and everything. Like, that's a great place for us to go, and we always do. Like, we'll send trades in there and stuff, but it's also like there's specific people you'll text, you'll reach out to, DM, whatever it is, and you want their thoughts, and you kind of learn over time that you have, both of you have a good feel for the game. Both of you understand what you're doing. So you have this relationship where you can really bounce things off of each other. When you have that, it makes your life so much easier. It really is hard going at it alone. Like, Dynasty is tough. Valuations are difficult. even with the tools we have. So having somebody to be like, to check your work, validate your work, like Leo's saying, is so important. So important. So that really stuck with me from what you just said there. I got one more for you, Leo, before we get you out of here. All right. One more.
Yeah.
Two more.
Many.
Maybe two. Maybe two. All right. I personally have one more. We'll see what your eyes got for you. But as we head into the season, because we are there, man, we're there. As we head into the season, is there anything to exploit that we can't quite access in the off season? Like, is there anything you do differently once the season hits in terms of interacting with your league mates, any of those kind of things?
Yeah, I look for those windows, right? Because I think the windows are open all off season long for the most part. It just depends on how active the other managers are and how plugged in they are. But once the season starts, you get your windows. Usually everybody waits 4 weeks and then they make a decision. Am I contending? Do I have a chance? Am I 0-4? Do I need to recalibrate? Do I need to rebuild? Am I tossing in the towel? What am I doing? And so I think you just really need to be cognizant of what those windows are. And, every league has a different culture. To Tommy B's point, every league is a different ecosystem. You kind of need to know when those breaks are, when people tend to move, and be ready for it. You don't want to have week 4 roll up on you and have no plan. So what I like to do is I kind of map out. I'd look at, okay, the first 4 weeks of the season, these are the 4 weakest teams that I see in the division at week 1. These are my 4 targets for potential future picks. And then I'm ready to go when the week 4 window hits. And if they're 0-4, okay, well now potentially there's some movement, right? Do they have a couple veterans on that team? If draft picks aren't a possibility, I guess in thinking that through, draft picks would be the possibility right at the start of the season.
Yes.
And then as you hit week 4, maybe it's a veteran player, right? That you might, if you're 4-0, that all of a sudden now becomes the difference maker as you come down the stretch and you start to look for potential sellers in the market. Or you have a team that's 2-2 or 3-1, but you're like, they're way overperforming. Well, now those are draft picks that you can look for because you're like, okay, 3-1 trade windows. Now they're going to think that draft pick is going to be 110 to 112. I just don't see it. I think they're going to be in the bottom 4. Let me see if I can get that first rounder now. Because again, week 4, they might 3-1. They might be saying, I need depth. I need an extra player. I need to round out that starting lineup. My first isn't that important. You just really need to be on top of what do their assets really look like, and is it realistic? Not just your team, not just evaluating your team, but are the other teams in my league, is their trajectory realistic for where I think they're going to finish?
Yeah, that's you kind of nailed it as you were talking through it. I thought the same thing. I was like, oh, it's picks, but then you're right, it's the vets. And I think what it is, it's these greater windows of access to those things, because a lot of the time of those misconceptions, which is something you do need to look at and try to plan for, understanding that this is a really weak team. Like, you already know that. And even if they're overperforming, it's not sustainable. So it's still something that you can attack. It's still an edge there for you that you can attack, and those windows open a little wider. So yeah, that's right where my head went with it too. Uriah, what you got for him?
Well, this is a little more personal, but your kiddo just turned 30.
Mm-hmm.
Did you get him into Dynasty, or did you get him into fantasy football at all?
So my son is not a fantasy football guy. Okay. But he loves fishbowl. So my son has been with me to every live draft in Boston. This year he didn't go, but the last couple he went to, and just was a spectator and got to hang out with all the guys. And he's gotten together, there's a couple of folks that live in the New England region. We get together pretty regularly. A couple times a year we hang out. We go to like Portsmouth, New Hampshire, or I'll drive up to Maine and see Zach Reed, or, and my son will generally, tag along. My son has become friends with them and likes the community, likes to interact, really likes being involved with Fantasy Cares and, some of the stuff that Russ, Dynasty Outhouse, and Bob Gilchrist and those guys do, John Bosch. Those guys, what they do, he likes to be involved in that and, get the merchandise. But as far as actually playing, he's never really got into the minutia, the data, the analytics. That's not his thing. He likes the fact that I do it. He likes to be able to tell all his buddies that do their fantasy football leagues that my dad, drops content or gets on Sirius XM and podcast. So he likes that. He likes that aspect of it. But as far as doing it himself, it's never. And I've never forced him. Right. I think that's important. I think that you want your kids to have a love for something, and whatever they tend to find, as long as it's positive, you support them. My son does a lot of reenacting. My son does like Rev War reenacting because he's in New England.
Oh, that's cool.
Stuff that I never would have. He goes to Gettysburg and does Civil War reenacting with his buddies, and it's not something that I would ever have done. But again, I try to be as supportive as possible, simply because I want him to feel encouraged. Even at 30, man, parenting never stops. I want him to feel encouraged, and I want him to feel that he's got somebody that's in his corner, and whatever he's venturing out to do, he's got a support network. So. But yeah, as far as drafting teams, I think we did a co-team maybe 10 years ago, and by week 3 he was like, "Yeah, Dad, do whatever." The one thing I will say though, I remember we did win some cash that year, and he was like, "Okay, we're splitting that."
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, you got to reap the rewards now. I love that. Oh man, that's so cool. Yeah, ending the show on a heartfelt note, man. Yeah, we were talking before the show. I just became a new dad. I mean, Uriah is a dad, and so that just really, really resonates with us. And you're a great dad, Leo, like clearly. So it's just like really cool to see. Really, really cool to see. I love seeing that stuff. I do want to say you gave a lot of shout outs there, but Zach Reed, really good friend of ours, Tommy B, shout out, all these guys, go check out their content, Superflex, Super Show, Dynasty Dummies.
One more. Yeah. Let me throw one more out there. If there's anybody out there that wants to do some college fantasy football, right, or get familiar with what college players are coming into but my boys over at the Devi Royale. I think they do a fantastic, Kevin Coleman and his crew over there. They do a tremendous job, and so I want to give them a shout out as well, because they've got a Patreon and Discord, and they're rolling and putting out a ton of great college content. So certainly give them a shout out as well.
Yeah, Kevin, another one, good people, really one of the better people in the space. You also mentioned John Bosch. He's actually going to be joining us in the next couple weeks here to talk some strategy, but it's like auction strategy. And also Kevin, I did reach out to Kevin, and he is going to be coming on the show good. Maybe next month or something like that. So yeah, we have a couple of things planned, keeping your circle around. So we really, really appreciate you joining us, Leo. This was an absolute blast. If anybody wants to follow him, you can check him out on Twitter at Siga_FF. Is there anything else that you're doing, any content, anything that you want to let people know about before we do get out of here?
I got a couple articles in the hopper that I'm working on. Again, it's just not a steady stream, but I've got one that I'm working on that has to deal with knowing when to take the jump. So I guess the concept, what I'm trying to work through is like, if you had a particular player, and when do you sell, right? Do you sell at a 20% increase? Do you hold and push a 40% increase, but then run the risk, because the longer you hold, potentially the bottom can fall out. Right. So what does that look like from almost like a mathematical perspective? Like, when is any profit? Is it a mantra of any profit is worth it, or is it max profit is worth it? And what are the correlating factors, the context that drives that? Is it a that you just love that player and you're trying to max it out, or is it age related? So I'm really trying to work through the minutia of that to try to really put a positive piece together that I think can really help some of the folks that have a difficult decision knowing when to cash out or when to buy. And I think this will help. That'll drop on Football Guys whenever I can, really kind of work through it and get it. As a perfectionist, I'll have 20 different drafts of it before it's really ready to go. And then I think for the Football Guys, like I said, that's where you find my work. There's a bunch of articles already on the site. There's a free one that's it's actually pinned to my Twitter page. It's like 11 life hacks for dynasty trading that I think could, for somebody who's not really confident making trades, and how to go about the different the atmosphere involved with trading, that this would help. So check that out. And then I do a Ask Me Anything on the Football Guys Discord one Tuesday a month. I think I'm up to 17th of September. So if there's any Football Guys subscribers that are out there that are in the Discord channel, I do that for the Dynasty questions once a month. So, but that's pretty much, find me on Twitter. I'm available. DMs are open. You can ask me questions. Certainly love interacting with the audience, and certainly available for any questions that are out there.
Man, that's great stuff. And sporadic or not, I love how you concoct the content because you take your time, you really develop the thought. I've seen you talk about this, how like it won't quite be how you want it. You're a perfectionist. I love that stuff, but it ends up making for really, really unique and cool content. So everybody definitely go check out what Leo is doing. Again, we really appreciate your time, Leo. And thank you for everybody joining us, and catch us next week. Peace out.